On August 15th, Russian President Vladimir Putin led a high-level delegation to Alaska for talks with the Trump administration. While no formal agreements were reached, both sides called the meeting productive. Shortly after, during a White House meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, Trump laid out a map of the front lines in front of the Ukrainian president and his European backers. The message was unmistakable. He was pressuring Ukraine to cede territory for peace. Facing this pressure from his largest and most important supporter, Zelensky had no choice but to bend, not only agreeing to negotiate without a ceasefire, but also, for the first time, softening his position on the territorial issue. This gave many a flicker of hope for peace. However, not only did the fighting on the front lines intensify, but within days, all sides began to pour cold water on the idea of peace talks. In an August 23rd speech, Zelensky reiterated that Ukraine would not hand over territory to an occupier. The next day, Russia's foreign minister stated there were no plans for a leadership summit with Ukraine. Even Trump, who had been the most vocal proponent of mediation, began to lower his tone, no longer sounding so confident. When all the key players have demonstrated a supposed commitment to peace, why does a ceasefire in Ukraine remain so out of reach? I know many of you like to follow international affairs, but find the sheer volume of information overwhelming. Staring at your phone for too long can strain your eyes. Why not try a different way? Turn off the screen and let your ears take in the story. Click on the soda music icon in the bottom left corner of the video to listen directly. The audio continues playing even when your screen is locked, and it will automatically recommend similar content after a video ends. It also supports a sleep timer, making it perfect for your commute or work breaks. Give it a try. The reality is, while all parties pay lip service to peace, it's the internationally expected and politically correct thing to do, their statements don't necessarily reflect their true intentions. If you look at the war from each side's perspective, you'll find that aside from the United States, which may have some genuine interest in a deal, the actual combatants, Russia and Ukraine, probably prefer to keep the war going. For Russia, a quick end to the war would have been desirable in the first year, but now, whether from a military or political standpoint, a ceasefire is no longer in its national interest. Militarily, while the war has looked like a stalemate for the past 3 years with slow Russian advances, this doesn't mean the two sides are evenly matched. The front lines have been stable for two main reasons. First, Russia, wanting to shield its domestic population from the pressures of war, has not carried out a full-scale national mobilization. Second, Ukraine, for the sake of international perception, has ordered its troops to hold the line at all costs, desperately conscripting men to replenish its forces. This has created a situation where, despite having only a quarter of Russia's population, Ukraine has often maintained a numerical advantage on the front lines. Even today, after several rounds of mobilization in Russia, the troop levels remain roughly balanced because of Ukraine's costly strategy of refusing to retreat. But this also means that when Ukraine starts to face manpower shortages, the problem is only going to get worse. They have no more reserves to call upon. The people who were willing to fight for Ukraine are already at the front. Recent developments on the battlefield confirm this. Just 3 days before Putin's meeting with Trump, the Russian military discovered a weak point in the Ukrainian defenses and punched through, advancing 15 kilometers and penetrating 2 defensive lines with little resistance. Despite Ukraine's elaborate fortifications, many of the trenches were simply empty. It's clear that Ukrainian forces are stretched to their breaking point. After more than 3 years of war, Russia has nearly exhausted Ukraine's manpower and is on the verge of reaping the rewards of its strategy. If they stop now, wouldn't all their previous sacrifices have been for nothing? Politically, the situation is also clear. The West's long-term containment of Russia, its unwavering support for Ukraine, and its decision to sabotage a near-successful peace deal in the early days of the war have completely discredited the pro-Western faction within Russia. In its place, the hardline nationalist camp has gained enormous influence. These are people who will never accept a ceasefire when Russia has the upper hand. Even if Putin himself were inclined to be a dove, he cannot ignore the domestic political climate. And from his own perspective, he may not want the war to end just yet, as it provides an opportunity to identify and promote a new generation of leaders who have proven their loyalty on the battlefield, replacing the old guard tied to the oligarchs. Even economically, a ceasefire isn't entirely beneficial for Russia. While sanctions might be gradually lifted, transitioning from a war economy back to a normal one is a difficult process that could be accompanied by mass unemployment and a short-term recession. Understanding this, it's clear that unless the West and Ukraine offer massive concessions, Russia has more to gain by continuing the war. Russia's response to American mediation reflects this reality. While they gave Trump the respect he craved, they offered no real cooperation. Not only did their army accelerate its advance, but diplomatically they showed no genuine sincerity. Putin may have gone to Alaska, but Russia has never officially stated its conditions for a ceasefire. All of the supposed Russian demands have come from American leaks or media speculation, not from official channels. Without clear terms, negotiations can't go anywhere. Putin's flattery of Trump was simply a strategic move to prevent further sanctions and to drive a wedge between the US, Ukraine, and Europe.
On the other side, even though Ukraine is on its last legs militarily, so desperate for soldiers that it has expanded conscription to men over 60, it still cannot accept a peace deal. Everyone knows the old saying, what you can't win on the battlefield, you can't win at the negotiating table. Any deal struck now would be disastrous for Ukraine. For starters, the 4 eastern regions that Russia has already annexed and incorporated into its constitution would certainly not be returned. For Ukraine, this would be a humiliating surrender of territory. Psychologically, the Ukrainian people could never accept such a nationally degrading outcome. Moreover, in 2022, the two countries had a draft agreement on the table. Russia was willing to withdraw its troops if Ukraine simply abandoned its bid to join NATO and respected the autonomy of the eastern regions. The Ukrainian government rejected that deal. To fight for 3 more years, lose nearly 1 million soldiers, and then sign an even worse agreement would be political suicide for the current government. And that suicide might not just be political. It could very well be physical. Never mind the risk of assassination by Ukrainian ultranationalists who refuse to accept reality. Even the West might decide it needs a scapegoat. To cover up their own roles in the war or to appease their own populations who are angry about the vast sums spent on a losing cause, they might just decide to borrow Zelensky's head. Therefore, even knowing that Ukraine has no chance of victory and that a peace deal is its best option, Zelensky cannot accept it. As long as he is in power, Ukraine will never cooperate with the peace process. But the United States no longer has the ability to simply replace him with a puppet who will play along. This is partly because the Trump administration dismantled much of America's regime change apparatus, and partly because Zelensky's control over his own military and intelligence services is firm enough to ensure his personal safety. And besides, which influential Ukrainian politician would willingly step into that trap now, knowing they would immediately have to sign a humiliating treaty and go down in history as a traitor? Furthermore, with Europe still vocally supporting Ukraine, Kyiv may not have fully grasped that it has no other options. While in the eyes of the US, China, and Russia, Europe is a rich but weak continent on the verge of becoming an item on the great power menu, in a country like Ukraine, which is steeped in the color revolution mindset, the worldview is that America is number 1 and Europe is number 2. In Zelensky's mind, if Europe is willing to step in, it can help Ukraine defeat Russia. Clinging to this unrealistic fantasy, Ukraine continues to resist negotiations, even in its current desperate situation. Without the cooperation of the two main combatants, no amount of mediation from the United States can possibly succeed.